A nanny cries with emotion after winning the lottery and decides to leave her husband to keep the prize. But when she goes to collect the prize, Emily would wake up before the sun rose, her routine beginning with a silent preparation for a day that promised to be as long as the previous ones. The house where she worked was large, imposing, with walls that held secrets and an atmosphere of comfort she had never experienced in her own home. Upon arrival, she was greeted by the cheerful laughter of the children whose eyes lit up when they saw her, as if she were the piece that completed the puzzle of their days. For Emily, every smile she could draw from these little souls was a silent victory, a reminder that despite everything, her work had value. The living room, with its luxurious furniture and soft carpets, contrasted with the simplicity that dominated Emily's life. She moved through the space with the grace of someone who already knew every corner, organizing scattered toys and adjusting pillows that never seemed to be out of place. The children's parents, though kind, kept a respectful distance as if there was an invisible line that separated them. They trusted Emily, but that trust came with a burden. She carried the responsibility of caring for what was most precious to them, but without ever forgetting that she was not part of that world. During playtime, Emily allowed herself to be carried away by the laughter, diving into the children's universe with a dedication that was almost maternal. She told stories full of magic and adventures, and the children listened to her with wide eyes as if every word was a revealed secret. "You're the best, Emily," said Sophie, the eldest, with a tight hug that warmed Emily's heart. But at the end of the day, when the house returned to silence and the children slept, she was left only with the echo of those words to keep her company. Ryan, her husband, never understood the significance of these small victories. For him, Emily's work was just that, work. And no matter how much she tried to explain how important she felt caring for those children, Ryan could not see beyond the salary she brought home. He did not see the laughter, the wiped tears, or the moments of tenderness that made Emily endure the harshness of her own life. Ryan remained oblivious to all of this, leaving Emily isolated in her silent struggle. At night, as the mansion's corridors darkened and the world outside quieted, Emily allowed herself a moment of reflection. Sitting on a bench in the garden, where the gentle breeze caressed her face, she thought about how life had become an endless sequence of sacrifices. The birds singing in the trees in the distance seemed free, but Emily felt trapped in an invisible cage where her wings, though intact, had no strength to fly. She wondered if she would ever be able to feel the same freedom she saw in the children running through the fields, without worrying about tomorrow. Despite the difficulties, Emily never let her pain show to the children. For them, she was an inexhaustible source of affection and patience, the anchor that kept them safe in a world that could sometimes be frightening. "Emily, will you stay here forever?" Sophie asked one night, her sleepy eyes full of hope in her voice. Emily smiled and stroked her golden hair, responding with the same sweetness. "As long as you need me, I'll be here." These words were true, but inside, Emily knew she couldn't promise much more than that. The nights at home were marked by a silence that weighed in the air, only broken by Ryan's harsh words. When Emily crossed the door, exhausted after a long day's work, his gaze already revealed the disdain he felt. "Smelling like dirty diapers again?" he muttered without taking his eyes off the television. Emily, holding back tears, knew that any response would only feed the contempt he had for her work. And so, she swallowed her pride and withdrew to a corner of the house, trying to avoid the inevitable confrontation. The arguments between them were frequent, always revolving around money. Ryan insisted that Emily's salary barely covered the expenses, questioning why she continued to work as a nanny. "You should get something worthwhile, something that really pays," he said, as if Emily's worth was only in the money she brought home. Emily, as much as she wanted to scream that her work had inestimable value, preferred silence. But that silence was eating away at her, as if with every word left unsaid, a part of her soul was lost. Ryan's insensitivity was not limited to words. It was in the gestures, or the lack of them, that Emily felt the true coldness. He rarely asked how her day was or if she was tired. The few times he showed interest were when he wanted to know how much money was left. To him, Emily was a cog in a machine that did not work well enough, and any mistake, no matter how small, was cause for more contempt. Emily wondered when the man she had fallen in love with had turned into this stranger who now shared her home. There were nights when Emily cried alone in bed, feeling the weight of the loneliness that accompanied her even when next to Ryan. He slept peacefully, unaware of the whirlwind of emotions she was experiencing. In her thoughts, Emily began to draw a fine line between what was bearable and what had already become unbearable. Each tear she shed was like a brick that separated her even more from Ryan, building a wall of resentment and pain. In the rare moments when Emily tried to discuss her feelings, Ryan would interrupt her with a wave of sarcasm. "Now you're going to tell me that taking care of kids is harder than my job?" he mocked, minimizing everything she did. Emily felt as if she was talking to a wall, her voice echoing in a void that would never be filled. Gradually, she gave up trying, storing each emotion in a dark corner of her mind, a place where Ryan could never reach. With each argument about money, Emily felt a growing desire to free herself from that life. It wasn't just Ryan's disdain that suffocated her, but the constant feeling that her worth was determined only by how much she contributed financially. She dreamed of one day waking up and not having to face his critical gaze, of living a life where her choices were respected. But these thoughts, though frequent, seemed as distant as the stars she saw through the window at night. Emily began to quietly cultivate a desire for change. She imagined herself far from that house, far from Ryan, in a place where she could breathe without feeling the weight of his insensitivity on her shoulders. It was an ordinary morning like so many others when Ryan came home with an unusually satisfied air. Emily, already accustomed to her husband's unpredictable moods, barely lifted her eyes from the coffee she was preparing. Ryan tossed the lottery ticket on the table, the thin paper floating until it landed next to Emily's cup. "Who knows, maybe luck will smile on us," he said, with a tone that mixed irony and hope. Emily looked at the ticket for a few seconds, without touching it. It was just a piece of paper, but in that moment, something inside her ignited, a spark of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Emily carefully picked up the ticket, her fingers sliding along the edges as if that small piece of paper could dissolve her worries. The ticket, still new and full of promises, seemed to carry a weight greater than its simple appearance. She knew the chances of winning were minimal, practically non-existent, but even so, she couldn't avoid thinking about what she would do if that ticket were the passport to a better life. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to dream. In her daydreams, Emily imagined herself in a new house, far from Ryan's disdain, in a place where she could breathe without fear, where every corner was a promise of a fresh start. She thought of the trips she had always wanted to take, the books she would read without hurry, the time she would spend taking care of herself. That ticket represented more than money. It was the possibility of freedom, of leaving behind everything that tied her to a life of sacrifices and sadness. She realized that for the first time in a long time she had something to look forward to. But as much as she wanted to cling to that hope, reality wouldn't let her fully give in to the dream. Emily knew that life was more complex, that luck was fickle, and that most of the time, it didn't favor those who needed it most. Even so, she kept the ticket in a safe place, as if it were a talisman, a small source of light in the midst of the darkness that surrounded her. It was a silent hope, but powerful enough to give her the strength to continue. The hours dragged on that afternoon, each tick of the clock echoing in Emily's mind as a reminder that time, no matter how slowly it passed, was still her greatest enemy. She looked at the ticket from time to time, as if it could give her some answer before the draw. With each glance, a new thought emerged. What if? How would it be? Do I deserve it? They were questions that left her in a state of anticipation and apprehension, but also of a strange comfort. When night fell, bringing with it the quiet of a new cycle, Emily prepared to sleep, but sleep did not come easily. In the dim light of the room, she closed her eyes and allowed herself one last thought before finally falling asleep. If only I were lucky. With that, her heart beat a little faster, fueled by the hope that perhaps fate was finally on her side. The day began like any other, without omens that something grand was about to happen. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, when Ryan came in with the newspaper in hand. He threw the newspaper on the table with a sigh and went straight to the point. "Let's see if we had any luck with that ticket." The words came out without enthusiasm, but in Emily, a spark of anxiety was lit. Her heart beat a little faster as Ryan began to check the numbers. When Ryan read the first number, the indifference on his face gave way to a look of surprise. He checked the ticket again, then the newspaper, and suddenly, all the numbers lined up perfectly. Emily watched him in silence, the sound of her own heartbeat echoing in her ears. We won," Ryan murmured, almost in disbelief. The world around Emily stopped. The phrase resonated in her mind like a distant echo that finally found its way to her heart. Emily brought her hand to her mouth, trying to contain a gasp of surprise, but the tears started to well up before she could process what was really happening. That small piece of paper, which had represented only a vague hope, was now the key to a completely new life. She felt her legs go weak, needing to lean on the table to avoid falling. "Is it true?" Her voice came out trembling, almost inaudible. Ryan, still in shock, could only nod. Emotions overflowed from Emily all at once. She started to cry, but this time, they were tears of pure joy. It was as if all the frustrations, the exhaustion, and the humiliations of the past years had found an outlet in that moment. Ryan watched, confused, not understanding the depth of what it meant to her. For Emily, that ticket was more than money. It was proof that fate, for once, was on her side. The feeling of relief that flooded her was so intense that for a few minutes she just cried, unable to say a word. When she finally managed to regain her composure, Emily began to imagine the endless possibilities that now lay before her. For the first time, she felt in control of her life, free to make choices that had seemed impossible until then. She saw herself leaving that house, traveling to places she had only known through photos, buying a home where she could feel peace. Emily allowed herself to dream, but this time, the dreams were tangible, within her reach. For the first time in a long time, she had the power to change the course of her life. The images of a new life passed through her mind like a movie, a cozy apartment, far from painful memories, maybe a new city where no one knew her as Ryan's wife. Emily mentally traveled through these scenarios, each one more beautiful than the last, and felt a new energy take over her. It was as if the chains that had bound her to the past had finally been broken. The feeling of freedom was almost intoxicating, an emotion she could barely control. As Ryan began talking about what they would do with the money, Emily barely listened. She was already beyond that moment, silently building her new life. Every word from Ryan seemed distant, irrelevant, because now, for the first time, she knew she could be the master of her destiny. The days following the discovery of the prize were a mix of euphoria and introspection for Emily. She began to realize that, more than the money itself, what really mattered was the freedom it provided. Lying in bed, late at night, while Ryan slept beside her, she mentally replayed the years of disdain, the harsh words and the loneliness that had marked her marriage. And the more she thought about it, the more she was convinced that this was the moment to take control of her own life. Emily reflected on what she would do with the fortune that now seemed to shine like a new dawn in her life. With each thought, the image of a future without Ryan became clearer and more irresistible. She saw herself far from that house, without the critical looks and cutting words, living in a place where she could finally be herself, without fear of judgment. The decision to ask for a divorce arose as an inevitability, an action that, although painful, seemed to be the only way to achieve the peace and happiness she had always desired. The memories of the most difficult moments resurfaced like a movie projected in her mind. She saw herself enduring Ryan's criticisms, enduring the contempt, always thinking that things might get better. But now, with the power of money, she no longer needed to wait. Emily knew that the decision to leave Ryan was not a simple escape, but a conscious choice not to accept less than she deserved. It was an affirmation of her worth, something she had lost over the years, but now was determined to regain. However, this decision was not made without tears. Emily spent sleepless nights wondering if she was being selfish, if she should try one more time, if the love that once existed could still be revived. But all the answers she found pointed to the same conclusion. The love that had sustained her marriage was dead, suffocated by years of disrespect and indifference. She realized that she was more bound to fear than to the relationship itself. And if she wanted to be truly happy, she needed to break free from these invisible chains. The conversations with her own heart were long and painful. Emily sought justifications, reasons to stay, but each argument seemed fragile in the face of the new reality she could build. "You deserve more," whispered an inner voice, a voice she hadn't heard in a long time. And with that phrase came the understanding that for years she had underestimated her own worth. The money was not just a fortune. It was an opportunity to rediscover herself, to live for herself, something that Emily knew was her right, even if she had to break old ties to achieve it. With her heart decided, Emily began to plan the separation. Every step was meticulously thought out, from the choice of words to the ideal moment for the conversation. She knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be pain and perhaps regret, but she also knew that she couldn't go back. This was the chance of her life, the chance to redeem herself, to free herself from a past that suffocated her. And above all, it was the chance to live, truly, for the first time in many years. The moment arrived like a silent storm. Emily waited until the end of the day when dinner was served and the house was enveloped in an artificial calm. Ryan was distracted, skimming through the newspaper as he did every night, oblivious to the whirlwind of thoughts running through Emily's mind. With her heart racing, she decided she could wait no longer. "Ryan, we need to talk," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. Ryan looked up, surprised by his wife's unusual tone, who usually avoided direct confrontations. He put the newspaper aside, frowning with a hint of irritation. "What is it now?" The frustration in his voice was already familiar, but Emily was not deterred. She took a deep breath, the words weighing on her tongue, ready to be spoken. "I want a divorce," she announced, letting the phrase echo in the room. Ryan's reaction was immediate. His eyes widened and the color drained from his face. For a moment, he seemed not to believe what he had just heard. "You must be joking," Ryan replied, the disbelief quickly turning into anger. "After everything we've been through, this is how you want to solve things? With a divorce?" The frustration in his voice grew, mixed with a hint of desperation. But Emily did not back down. She kept her gaze firm, her determination clear in every gesture. "I'm not joking, Ryan. This is no longer healthy." "I can't keep living like this," she replied, each word measured carefully, though her heart was pounding in her chest. Ryan's anger turned into sarcasm. "Oh, so now that you have money, you think you can just discard me?" He stood up, trying to intimidate her with his posture, but Emily remained still. "It's not about the money, Ryan," she said calmly. "It's about what I want for my life from now on. I can't live in a relationship where there's no respect, where I constantly feel belittled." The words flowed now with a confidence she didn't know she possessed, each one reinforcing her decision. Ryan shook his head, incredulous. "You're not thinking straight. This is madness, Emily." He tried to approach her, softening his tone as if trying to convince a child to give up a silly idea. "We can work this out. We don't need to take such drastic measures." But Emily, for the first time, felt she was in control of her own story. She could no longer let herself be swayed by the emotional manipulation that Ryan had always known how to use so well. "I've thought a lot about this, Ryan, and my decision is made." The fury returned to Ryan's eyes. "And what do you think you'll do without me? Do you think this money will bring you happiness? You'll quickly find out that you're making a big mistake," he threatened, trying to impose the last drop of control over her. But Emily had already crossed the point of no return. "I'd rather take that risk than continue living a life where I'm constantly devalued," she replied, her voice firm, but not devoid of pain. She knew she was cutting ties with someone who had once been important to her, but she also knew it was the only way to free herself. Ryan, realizing that Emily would not change her mind, gave her a cold, resentful look. "If that's what you want, then go ahead. But don't expect me to make things easy for you," he said, before turning his back and leaving the room, leaving Emily alone. His words hung in the air, but Emily was not shaken. She felt the weight of the decision, but also a new lightness, as if she had finally rid herself of a burden she had carried for years. Now she was ready to move on, without looking back. With the divorce decided, Emily felt a new energy taking over her being. It was as if the weight she had carried on her shoulders for years was finally beginning to dissipate. For the first time, she could look to the future with optimism, without the fear that had always prevented her from dreaming. Sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her, Emily began to outline the first plans for her new life. Each word she wrote was a step toward the freedom she so longed for. The first item on Emily's list was to find a new house. She wanted a place that would be her refuge, where she could create new memories far from the shadows of her past. She imagined a small, cozy house, surrounded by trees, perhaps near a lake. A place where the silence would be broken only by the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind. A home that reflected the peace she finally hoped to find. She could almost smell the aroma of fresh coffee, feel the warmth of the sun entering through the windows, and the tranquility of living in a space that was entirely hers. Next, Emily thought about the trip she had always dreamed of taking but had never had the chance. Paris, with its streets full of history and culture, Tuscany, with its rolling hills and vineyards, or perhaps Japan, with its ancient temples and cherry blossoms. Between the travel plans and the search for a new home, Emily also thought about how she could use some of her money to help others. Perhaps she could start a small charity where she could support women who, like her, needed a new chance. She knew that the fortune she had won would not only change her life, but could also transform the lives of many other people. This thought brought her deep satisfaction, as if by sharing her luck, she was giving an even greater purpose to her victory. As the days passed, the feeling of imminent freedom filled Emily with a joy she could barely contain. Each morning brought with it new hope, a new opportunity to plan the life she had always wanted. She began to see herself as an independent, strong woman, capable of shaping her own destiny. The image of herself smiling, free from the ties of the past, was a reflection she wanted to see in the mirror every day. And with each plan she made, that future became more and more real. Emily also began to take care of herself in ways she had neglected for a long time. Small gestures like buying new clothes or getting beauty treatments became rituals of renewal. Each choice, each small change was a symbol of her new life, free from the criticism and disdain that had marked her previous years. She felt that she was finally returning to who she had always been, but who had been lost amid so many concessions and sacrifices. The big day had finally arrived. Emily woke up with a feeling of euphoria mixed with slight anxiety, as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to take a leap that would change her life forever. The sun was rising on the horizon, tinting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink as she carefully prepared, choosing the blue dress she liked so much, the one that always made her feel confident. Every detail mattered that day, the simple yet elegant hairstyle, the soft perfume that carried the promise of a new beginning. Everything reflected the bright future she imagined was just a few steps away. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Emily almost didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. There was something different in her eyes, a sparkle of hope that hadn't existed before. She smiled at herself, thinking about how life can change so unexpectedly. The memories of dissolve sadness and despair seemed distant, almost as if they belonged to someone else. Now all she saw was the strong and determined woman she had become, ready to take control of her life. And today everything would begin to materialize into. As she left the house, the fresh morning air enveloped Emily, making her take a deep breath as if she wanted to absorb all the positive energy the day promised. The journey to the place where she would receive the prize was made with a mixture of anxiety and expectation. Each step she took brought her closer to her dreams, to a new life full of possibilities. Emily could barely contain the happiness that pulsed within her, an almost surreal feeling that, from that moment on, everything would be different. Arriving at the imposing building where the prize would be awarded, Emily felt her heart race. The lobby was quiet, almost empty, except for a few people waiting anxiously, each with their own dreams and hopes. Emily joined them, but her mind was already far away, imagining the next steps in her life. This is it, she thought, feeling a wave of emotion as she realized that, in a few minutes, everything she had planned would begin to come true. As she waited, she recalled the plans she had made in recent days, the new house, the trips, the opportunities that would open up before her. Every detail seemed more real now, as if she could already touch them. Emily was called, and with firm steps, she walked into the room where they were waiting for her. The atmosphere was formal, but for her, it seemed to glow with the possibilities that were approaching. She sat in the chair in front of the manager, who greeted her with a professional smile. While he began explaining the process for delivering the prize, Emily could barely pay attention. Her mind was already in the future, on the choices she could finally make for herself. Without fear or hesitation, she barely heard the words that followed, each second seeming to stretch as the feeling that she was a step away from freedom became almost palpable. Emily signed the papers presented to her with trembling hands of excitement, feeling that with each signature, she was leaving the past behind and embracing a future full of promises. Fate was on her side and she was ready to start anew. Emily smiled, anticipating the moment when she would finally free herself from all the chains that had kept her bound for so many years. Emily felt an almost palpable joy as the lottery manager organized the documents in front of her. The sound of pages turning, the pen scratching the paper, everything seemed part of a ritual that would culminate in the realization of her dreams. But suddenly, the manager's movements stopped. He frowned, reviewing the papers more carefully. Emily noticed the change in his expression, and a feeling of discomfort began to grow in her chest. "I'm sorry, Mom, but there seems to be a problem here," he said, looking at her with a mix of caution and surprise. Confused, Emily felt her heart race, a hint of fear piercing the bubble of euphoria she was enveloped in. "What kind of problem?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady, though a sense of panic was beginning to emerge. The manager hesitated for a moment, as if choosing the right words. "The ticket, it's registered in the name of Ryan Matthews," he explained, looking directly at her. The words seemed to resonate in the empty room, echoing in her mind as reality slowly dawned on her. The floor seemed to disappear beneath her feet. Emily was paralyzed, unable to fully grasp what this meant. How could the ticket be in Ryan's name? Her mind desperately tried to find an explanation that made sense, but everything turned into a whirlwind of disjointed thoughts. How is that possible?" she stammered, feeling the words come out like a desperate whisper. The manager just repeated the information, his voice sounding distant and cold, while Emily tried to process what that really meant. Every plan she had built, every dream she had nurtured over the past weeks seemed to crumble before her, like a house of cards hit by a gust of wind. The bitterness of the discovery filled her heart, turning euphoria into deep despair. Everything she had imagined, the new house, the travels, the much-desired freedom, was now out of her reach, all because of a simple name on a piece of paper. The reality was brutal, and the truth hurt more than anything she had ever faced. Emily felt her eyes fill with tears, but she fought to hold them back, refusing to break down there in front of strangers. But the emotional impact was overwhelming. She had built her hopes on a fallacy, believing that the future was hers when, in fact, everything was still in Ryan's hands. The sense of powerlessness that overtook her was crushing, as if an invisible force was pulling her down, drowning her in a sea of despair from which she could not escape. As the manager's words continued to echo in her mind, Emily was overwhelmed by a sense of betrayal. Everything she thought she had been achieving with so much effort now seemed to slip through her fingers, leaving only the bitter taste of disappointment. Ryan, the man she was about to separate from, held all the control over the fortune that was supposed to be the passport to her new life. It was as if fate was mocking her, taking away her last hope, just when she believed she had won her freedom. Emily returned home with a heavy heart, her trembling hand still holding the papers that hours earlier symbolized her freedom. Anger and pain mingled in her chest as she thought about how she would confront Ryan. The words still echoed in her mind. The ticket was in his name. She knew that conversation would be decisive and that somehow she would have to convince him to share the prize, even though the idea of negotiating with the man she wanted to leave behind made her nauseous. When Ryan arrived home, the tension in the air was palpable. Emily tried to stay calm even though she was burning inside. "We need to talk," she began, her voice firm despite the nervousness. She explained what she had discovered, watching Ryan's reaction closely. At first he seemed surprised, but soon a cynical smile appeared on his face. "So that's it? You thought you could just leave me and walk away with all the money?" Ryan asked, with an irony that cut like a knife. Emily, trying to maintain her composure, explained that the prize should be shared. After all, they were married, and she believed that even with the divorce, he would understand that it was fair for both to benefit from the unexpected luck. But instead of responding with the same reasonableness, Ryan crossed his arms, his gaze cold and calculating. "You're crazy if you think you'll see a cent of this money," he said, his voice filled with resentment. "You wanted to leave me behind, Emily. Well, now it's me who will move on without you." Ryan's coldness was shocking but also revealing. Emily realized that the man in front of her was much more calculating and cruel than she had imagined. He not only refused to share the prize but seemed pleased to use this situation to punish her for wanting a divorce. "You deceived me all this time," Ryan continued, raising his voice, "planning your exit as if I were dead weight. Well, now it's me who will live the life you dreamed of. And you'll get what you deserve." Emily tried to argue, appealing to any trace of humanity that might still exist in Ryan. "We spent years together, Ryan. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. But he just laughed, a bitter laugh that echoed through the walls of the house. "It did. Yes. Until you decided to betray me like this. But now, you mean nothing to me, Emily. And this money, this prize, it's all mine." Every word from him was like a blow, but Emily remained firm, refusing to give in to the pain that threatened to overwhelm her. She knew she had to fight, that she had to try, even if the chances were slim. "You know this isn't fair, Ryan," she said now, with an almost eerie calm. "This isn't how things should end." But deep down, she already knew she was losing. Ryan had shown his true face, and there was no room for compassion or justice in it. Finally, Ryan just shrugged. "Life isn't fair, Emily. It never was," he said before turning and leaving the room, leaving Emily alone with the weight of the devastating reality. She stood there, paralyzed, listening to the sound of Ryan's footsteps moving away, echoing like a hammer striking her heart. Everything she had planned, everything she had dreamed of was crumbling before her. And now, Emily found herself on the edge of an abyss she didn't know how to avoid. When the door closed behind Ryan, the silence that took over the house seemed deafening. Emily remained still, staring into the void in front of her, feeling as if her whole world had collapsed in a single instant. There were no more plans, no more dreams. The future she'd envisioned, full of hope and new possibilities, now seemed like a distant mirage, something she could barely believe she had once considered real. She was without money, without a husband, and more than anything, without direction. Reality hit Emily with devastating force. She had risked everything, believing she could finally find happiness away from Ryan, but now found herself trapped in an even worse situation than before. Emily spent her days wandering around the house, not knowing what to do. The things that once brought some comfort or purpose now made no sense. Every object she touched, every space she walked through, only reinforced the feeling of loss. The walls seemed tighter, suffocating her with the weight of the choices she had made and the opportunities that were now out of her reach. With each passing day, the sense of isolation grew, fueled by the certainty that there was no one else she could count on. The night brought even more anguish. Lying in a bed that now seemed cold and empty, Emily relived every moment, every decision that had led her to that point. She thought about how everything could have been different if only she had acted differently, if she had seen the signs earlier. The proximity of freedom which she had come so close to touching with her fingertips was now a bitter memory that haunted her. Regret was like a constant shadow, whispering in her ear that she had failed, that she had lost her only chance to be happy. Over time, hopelessness began to infiltrate her thoughts. Emily couldn't see how she could start over, how she could get up after falling so deep. Life without Ryan, without the money that would allow her to escape, seemed like a barren desert with no horizon. The idea of starting from scratch, of rebuilding her life with so little, was almost unbearable. Every attempt to plan a way forward was frustrated by uncertainty and fear. Emily felt there was no strength left within her to keep fighting. In the dark days that followed her downfall, Emily isolated herself from the world, submerged in her own pain. But slowly, a light began to infiltrate her darkness. The first person to extend a hand was Mrs. Hampton, whom Emily had served as a nanny for so many years. She appeared at Emily's door with a homemade cake and a compassionate look that almost broke the wall of bitterness Emily had built around herself. "I heard what happened," Mrs. Hampton said, her voice soft and understanding. "Please let me help." Though hesitant at first, Emily accepted the gesture, feeling a small flame of hope ignite in her heart. The cake was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, other people who had crossed Emily's path over the years began to show up. The Wilson family, whose house Emily had cared for in difficult times, sought her out, offering words of encouragement and an offer for any practical help she might need. Each visit, each phone call, was a reminder that, even in the darkest moments, she wasn't completely alone. Among these visits, what touched Emily most were the small gestures. Mrs. Hampton invited her for tea, and the children she had once cared for came running to hug her, filling her with affection and laughter she hadn't heard in so long. An old colleague of Ryan's, who had always admired Emily's patience and care, offered to review her divorce documents without charging anything. Each act of kindness was like a rope thrown into a deep well, helping her climb, little by little, towards the surface. Over time, Emily began to realize that the true riches in her life were not in a lottery ticket or a full bank account. They were in human connections, in the friendships she had cultivated over the years, often without realizing how valuable they were. It was a painful discovery, but at the same time, deeply healing. The true fortune was in every gesture of support, in every word of comfort that helped her rebuild what had been destroyed. The days began to be less lonely. Emily, once confined in her own sadness, began to leave the house to visit these friends and former employers. She found herself sitting in well-tended gardens, drinking tea and laughing again, albeit timidly. Each conversation was a balm for her wounded soul, each meeting a step towards healing. Emily began to feel that despite everything she had lost, there was still something to fight for, something to live for. Amidst these encounters, Emily once again found herself surrounded by the children she had cared for so much. They ran around her, laughing and shouting, bringing back memories of simpler and happier days. "We missed you, Emily," said Sophie, one of the girls who had grown up under her care. That phrase, so simple and full of love, brought tears to Emily's eyes. But this time, they were tears of gratitude. She realized that in the end, what mattered wasn't what she had lost, but what she still had. These small gestures of kindness became Emily's anchor, holding her steady as she navigated the turbulent waters of her new reality. And so, surrounded by friends and memories of better times, Emily began to rise again. It wasn't money that would save her, but love and human connection which revealed themselves as the greatest treasure of her life. Emily began to understand that sometimes, You have to lose everything to discover what really matters. With the unexpected support of friends and former employers, Emily began to see life in a new light. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she felt stronger every day, determined to rebuild her life with a new purpose. Emily realized that despite all the losses, she still possessed something invaluable: the ability to reinvent herself. She decided that her happiness would no longer depend on money or anyone else. It was time to focus on her own self-worth, to regain the respect for herself that she had long lost. She started with small steps. Instead of seeking immediate big changes, Emily focused on taking care of herself in ways she had previously neglected. She began setting aside moments for meditation, where she could silence the world's noise and reconnect with her own thoughts and feelings. Slowly, she returned to reading the books she had always loved, rediscovering the pleasure of stories and the power of words to inspire and console. These seemingly simple activities were, in fact, the foundation on which she began to build her new life. The process of rebuilding also involved a deep reevaluation of her values. Emily, who once saw money as the key to freedom, began to understand that true freedom was emotional and mental. She didn't need a fortune to be happy. She needed inner peace and an environment where she could flourish without fear or external pressures. This realization brought a calmness she hadn't felt in a long time, allowing her to look to the future with more clarity and less anxiety. Emily also rediscovered her value in the work she did. Although she had previously felt ashamed of being just a nanny, she now saw the profound impact she had on the lives of the children she cared for and the families who trusted her. The joy in the children's eyes, the words of gratitude from the parents. All of this was proof that her work had an invaluable worth. With this new perspective, Emily decided that if she were to continue working as a nanny, she would do so with pride, knowing that her role in these families' lives was essential and significant. As she rebuilt her life, Emily also learned to set boundaries and prioritize her well-being. The trauma she had suffered taught her that she needed to protect herself emotionally, not allowing others to devalue or disrespect her. This new attitude attracted people into her life who respected and valued who she was, creating a support circle that strengthened her even more. Emily realized that by taking care of herself, she was attracting the kind of respect and love she had always desired. Each day was a step towards a new Emily, a stronger, wiser woman who was deeply aware of her own worth. She stopped comparing herself to others or measuring her success by what she possessed materially. Instead, her focus was on growing internally, on cultivating the peace of mind and emotional freedom she had fought so hard to find. Money, though useful, was no longer the goal. It was just a means to live with dignity and comfort without sacrificing her soul. Ryan finally had everything he ever wanted, a life of luxury, surrounded by everything money could buy. He moved into a new, modern house with glass walls that offered a stunning view of the city. The cars in the garage were the most expensive and coveted, and the parties he hosted were attended by wealthy and influential people. But even amidst all this glitter, there was something that bothered Ryan, a shadow he couldn't shake off. Over time, Ryan realized that the initial excitement of the new acquisitions began to fade. The parties, which once made him feel powerful, became monotonous, and the friends who came to his celebrations seemed more interested in what he could offer than in his company. The superficial conversations and forced laughs left Ryan empty, and when the last glass of champagne was emptied, and the last guest left, he found himself alone, surrounded by objects that didn't fill the void inside him. Emily's absence was palpable, a hole that no amount of money could fill. Ryan didn't realize it, but he had built a life of appearances, and without Emily, his house, no matter how luxurious, had no soul. He spent hours wandering through the empty corridors, remembering the moments when her presence filled the environment with a calmness he had never known how to appreciate. The irony was bitter. Now that he finally had what he always wanted, the person with whom he could share it had disappeared from his life. The nights were the hardest. Ryan lay in his king-size bed alone, and the silence of the house was almost deafening. He found himself thinking about Emily, wondering what she was doing, feeling uncomfortably guilty for the way he had treated her. At first he tried to drown these emotions in more parties, more purchases, but nothing seemed capable of erasing the feeling that he had lost something money couldn't buy. The love and respect Emily had offered him, which he had thrown away without hesitation. While Emily was in his life, Ryan never realized the depth of what they had or could have had. He thought power lay in money. But now, surrounded by everything money could buy, he felt weaker and more vulnerable than ever. The things he bought didn't fill him. Instead, they made him more aware of the emptiness inside him. Loneliness was his only companion, and even surrounded by luxury, Ryan felt Emily's absence as a physical pain. The lack of purpose began to weigh on him. Before, he had the excuse that he was working for something, that money would bring happiness, but now that he had everything, he realized he was wrong. Ryan's life became a repetitive cycle of boredom and dissatisfaction, a cruel reflection of what happens when you lose sight of what really matters. He wondered if he would ever be able to find what he had lost, but deep down, he knew the answer was a resounding no. Ryan's solitary reflections led him to a harsh truth. He might have won the lottery, but in the process, he lost everything that really mattered. He distanced himself from Emily, and, with her, from any chance of finding genuine happiness. Emily walked through the park, the golden afternoon sun warming her face as a gentle breeze stirred the leaves around her. It was a peaceful day, and she felt a peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. As she watched the children playing in the distance and listened to the carefree laughter that filled the air, Emily realized how much she had changed. She was no longer chasing an ideal of happiness based on wealth or status. Instead, she found contentment in the little things, in human connections, and in her own inner strength. She remembered everything she had faced: the disillusionment, the fear, the pain of losing what she thought was the key to happiness. But instead of making her bitter, these experiences had shaped her into a more resilient person, more aware of her own worth. Emily learned that true freedom didn't come from being able to buy whatever she wanted, but from knowing herself deeply, from knowing what really mattered in her life. This new perspective brought a serenity she had never known before. The lessons life had taught her, often in a hard way, now seemed like gifts wrapped in challenges. Every obstacle she faced forced her to look inside herself, to confront her fears and insecurities, and to discover a strength she never imagined she possessed. Emily realized that despite everything she had lost, she had gained something infinitely more valuable: the ability to rise again, to reinvent herself, and to live life on her own terms. Sitting on a park bench, she watched the sunset paint the sky orange and pink, and a peaceful smile spread across her face. There was a simple beauty in that moment that couldn't be bought or sold, something that could only be appreciated by someone who had found peace within themselves. Emily realized that in her journey, she had achieved a much deeper freedom than material: the freedom to be who she was, without fear, without regrets. Emily's thoughts turned to the past, but now without pain or sadness. She allowed herself to remember Ryan and everything that happened, but without resentment. Instead, she felt a kind of gratitude for having gone through all that, because it was through those difficulties that she discovered what really mattered. Emily knew that life would always have challenges, but now she was confident that she could face them, not with despair, but with the wisdom she had gained. As the sun finally set, Emily felt a deep gratitude for being where she was emotionally and spiritually. She had found a new life, not based on wealth or on what others thought of her, but on her own truth. Happiness, she discovered, wasn't something to be pursued, but something that naturally emerged when living with authenticity and courage. And it was this realization that brought her a peace no amount of money could buy. As she stood up and began walking back home, Emily knew that no matter what the future brought, she was ready. With a light heart and a clear mind, she had finally found what she had always sought. Not the fleeting glitter of fortune, but the enduring inner light that would guide her through the days to come. If you enjoyed Emily's incredible story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. If you love emotional chronicles and want to support our channel to continue bringing more quality content, consider contributing through Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the first pinned comment. Your help is essential for us to keep improving. Thank you for your support. See you in the next exciting chronicle.